Hello, I'm Michael Serapio. Canada's closest neighbour is once again taking aim at its trading partners. Late this afternoon, Donald Trump introducing sweeping tariffs against countries that exchange goods with the United States. That begins with a 10% baseline tariff on all foreign goods entering that country.
Toyota sells 1 million foreign-made automobiles into the United States, and General Motors sells almost none. Ford sells very little. None of our companies are allowed to go into other countries. And I say that friend and foe, and in many cases the friend is worse than the foe in terms of trade. But such horrendous imbalances have devastated our industrial base and put our national security at risk. I don't blame these other countries at all for this calamity. I blame former presidents and past leaders who weren't doing their job. They let it happen. And they let it happen to an extent that nobody can even believe. That's why, effective at midnight, we will impose a 25% tariff on all foreign-made automobiles.
Now, during that speech, Trump did mention Canadian dairy, but take a look at what the White House fact sheet actually says about Canada. First, USMCA compliant goods will continue to see a 0% tariff. Non-USMCA compliant goods will see a 25% tariff, and non-USMCA compliant energy and potash will see a 10% tariff. Well, to dig into this whole topic, we're now joined this evening by two people who are keeping a very close eye on this subject. We're first and foremost joined by Senator Hassan Yussuf in studio, and right beside him from the Canadian Vehicle Manufacturers Association, the President and CEO, Brian Kingston. Hello to both of you.
Thank you for having us.
So, Brian, I'll begin with you here because, you know, Donald Trump in that speech does talk about a 25% tariff on foreign-made cars, meaning cars made out of the United States. But then there's that subclause about USMCA compliant, or as we call it here, CUSMA compliant industries. So when you look at what was said today, how do you interpret that in terms of a tariff impact on the Canadian auto industry?
Well, first of all, somewhat positive news that reciprocal tariffs were not applied to Canada that would be stackable on the existing automotive tariff. So what we know for Canadian facilities is that a 25% tariff will apply to a Canadian manufactured vehicle, but it will only comply to the non-USA built component of that vehicle. So in Canada, if you look at the facilities that Ford, General Motors, and Stellantis operate, over 50% of the parts and components in those vehicles are American. So Canada is in a relatively better off position than other auto industries in other countries around the world. Again, this is still going to drive cost throughout the supply chain, but all in all, the outcome could have been far worse today.
Okay, all in all, it could have been far worse, but we're still talking about a tariff ultimately on the Canadian auto industry. So talk to us about the impact that's going to have.
It will make Canada less competitive when we're competing for automotive investment because this is now just a new cost of building vehicles in this country. More concerning is what happens on parts. There still is a threat of tariffs being applied to automotive parts, which cross the border multiple times, anywhere between 4 and 8 times in a typical North American assembled vehicle. So if you add that up, we could see huge costs through the supply chain, which ultimately means vehicle prices will go up between $4,500 and $10,000. You'll see demand go down, and we could see production slowdowns, not just in Canada, across the North American economy.
Okay, production slowdowns, which of course means, Senator, that people look at the possibility of either losing shifts or losing jobs altogether. So what's your response to what was announced today by the U.S. administration?
Listen, what this done is compound what the president's already done. Fentanyl and border tariff, steel and aluminum tariff, auto tariff, and now reciprocal tariff. All of this, of course, are going to have a devastating impact on the overall Canadian economy. And I think as we try to work through the details more specifically, I think we can expect, obviously, the economy is going to slow. Workers are going to get laid off from the workplaces across this country, and more importantly, that's just going to add to the uncertainty as we go forward. At a time where we have an agreement with the United States, that the United States are now not prepared to comply with USMCA, which the president negotiated, and it raised a serious question about the reliability of the United States as a trading partner. If they can't comply with an agreement that this president negotiated, what can we say for certain that this president would prepare to do should we negotiate or look at how we can examine the current agreement to make it better than it already is. But the reality is, of course, workers are going to be very worried today going to sleep tonight. And their families and communities should be very worried about what impact that's going to have on the broader economy, wherever they may live, if they work in a facility that are impacted by all these tariffs in totality. So I think for a country, of course, we've got to look at how we retaliate, and more importantly, how we're going to protect workers in the community going forward with the tariff revenue that we raise, to ensure that people going to be assured, until we sit down with the United States to figure out how we get through all of this, they need to be taken care of, and the government has got a huge responsibility in that regard.
Okay, huge responsibility, but you sit at the Prime Minister's Advisory Council on Canada-U.S. relations. So extrapolating from the meetings that you've had around that council, what is the government willing or prepared to do to help out Canadian workers? Because if it's not obvious now, I think from everything that we're hearing and seeing, it's going to be very obvious sooner rather than later that this is going to cause economic hardship.
It is. The government's already announced some measures that doesn't require Parliament to act, that workers will be entitled to EI, and they will make sure that the severance pay to worker doesn't disqualify them from starting to collect. The waiting period are gone, which is really important. But in addition to that, of course, as time goes on and the election will be over, Parliament will need to act to, of course, put some other measures in place to look after those workers that are impacted. Prime Minister already pledged that all of the tariff revenue that's raised are going to be spent to look after workers across this country. So I think all of that is good news. But in the same time, what workers really want to do is be assured they're going to have a job to go to and a workplace to go to, and they want to make sure they're going to have the things that we take for granted when we're working: a pension, a secure paycheck, and more importantly, that you don't have to worry waking up in the morning whether or not that job's going to be there.
Mm-hmm. You know, Brian, I had to note the fact that during the news conference today, or the event, or whatever you want to call it, that Donald Trump held in the Rose Garden of the U.S. White House, he had up there an auto worker from Michigan who was very enthusiastic that Donald Trump is talking about tariffing countries that the United States trades with. And part of that is this belief that Donald Trump will be able to bring to the United States production. We'll be able to bring back the car companies, reopen factories, reopen parts factories. Is that a danger, the very fact that Donald Trump may succeed in this for the Canadian auto industry?
It absolutely is a danger, but it's not feasible for a few reasons. First of all, the Americans build about 10 million vehicles a year. They consume 16 million. If you were to try and replace Canadian manufacturing capacity, you'd be talking about 5 to 6 assembly plants, billions of dollars, in at least 10 years to bring that back into the United States. During that process, you would be making U.S. manufacturers deeply uncompetitive. This industry has been founded on an integrated North American market, really going back to the 60s. While other countries are advancing, you look at Chinese manufacturing capacity, huge threat to the automotive industry. If we are fighting amongst ourselves and divvying up the North American market, we will all be worse off. So that may be the objective. It's not feasible.
Not feasible, as you say, but how much runway is there before that's discovered? Because, you know, I wonder whether or not, and you've been very optimistic throughout this whole process, saying that the facts will I guess in your hope, would influence the administration to stay away from such tariffs. But so far, that's not what's happening. So how much runway is there before the administration comes to that conclusion, do you think?
I think it's all going to come down to the American consumer. If people realize that their vehicle prices are going to go up by thousands of dollars at a time where the U.S. economy is already suffering from inflationary pressures, you add to that the potential for a global trade war if other countries retaliate in a coordinated fashion. If the American consumer feels that these policies are making them significantly worse off, there will be blowback. And that does take some time, but that's where this policy is ultimately going to lead.